The night before my wedding, my parents drugged me and shaved my head. Please stay with me as I tell you my story. My name is Emily Carter. I'm 28 years old, and I thought I was about to marry the love of my life, Daniel Hayes. He's the kind of man I never thought I'd find. Steady, supportive, gentle, and someone who truly sees me for who I am. Our wedding was supposed to be the happiest day of my life, a celebration of everything we had built together. But the night before, everything changed in a way I still struggle to wrap my head around. For as long as I can remember, my parents, Margaret and Frank Carter, have been impossible to please. They never saw me as an adult, no matter how old I got. My choices were always questioned, my achievements dismissed, and my independence criticized. Even when Daniel proposed, they weren't happy for me. Instead of joy, I got cold remarks like, "Are you sure he'll really stick with you?" Or, "You're rushing into this." I should have expected they would try to interfere, but I didn't think they'd go as far as they did. The evening before the wedding, my mother called me and said she wanted me to stay at my childhood home one last time. She insisted it was tradition, that a bride should spend her final night before marriage in her parents' house. Daniel didn't like the idea, but I didn't want to cause unnecessary conflict. A small part of me thought maybe they were finally trying to bond with me before letting me go. Against my better judgment, I agreed. Dinner was strangely formal. My mother had set the table with candles, my father poured wine, and for once they seemed calm. They talked about memories of me as a child, asked questions about the ceremony, and even smiled in a way I hadn't seen in years. For a moment, I felt almost comfortable, like I had the parents I always wished for. But as I sipped the wine my father poured, my body began to feel heavy. My eyelids dropped faster than they should have. I tried to stand, tried to say something, but the world blurred, and everything went dark. When I woke up, it was morning. The sunlight streamed through the curtains, but the weight of dread hit me before I even sat up. My head felt cold. My hands instinctively flew to my hair, except there was nothing. Every strand was gone. My scalp was bare, raw, and exposed. I stumbled to the mirror, and when I saw my reflection, I collapsed. Humiliation, horror, and disbelief hit me all at once. I didn't want to believe it, but deep down, I knew exactly who had done this. My parents stood in the doorway, not ashamed, not apologetic, just watching. And in that moment, I realized the people who raised me had done the cruelest thing imaginable the night before the most important day of my life. When I finally stood from the floor, my legs felt like they didn't belong to me. My reflection in the mirror had already told me everything, but the sound of their footsteps made it worse. My mother leaned against the doorframe, smirking like this was some sort of twisted game. "Daniel won't want you now," she said, her voice sharp enough to slice through me. My father added, "Men don't stay with women who look like that. You'll see." I wanted to scream, to demand why they hated me enough to do this, but the words caught in my throat. My mother crossed her arms and said they had done it for my own good. She claimed I was rushing into a marriage I didn't deserve, that I would thank them one day. My father nodded in agreement, telling me I was still their little girl, that I didn't belong to anyone else. Their faces showed no guilt, only pride in the cruelty they had just inflicted. Tears slid down my cheeks as I touched the bare skin of my head again, but I tried not to let them see how much it hurt. My mother turned away, telling me to get dressed because everyone was waiting downstairs. Confused, I asked what she meant, and she explained that the family had been invited for breakfast. My father's grin widened as he added that they wanted everyone to see what happens when Emily refuses to listen. I begged them not to make me go, but they wouldn't hear it. My mother shoved a dress into my hands and told me to hurry before the food got cold. With shaking fingers, I pulled it on, wishing more than anything that I could run out the front door and never look back. But I knew if I refused, they would drag me down anyway, and I wasn't ready to give them that satisfaction. The walk to the dining room felt like a walk through fire. I kept my head lowered, but gasps and whispers started the moment I entered. My aunts, uncles, and cousins all stared, their forks frozen halfway to their mouths. My mother smiled proudly at their shock and announced, "This is what happens when a daughter forgets who raised her." My father clapped his hands together like he was hosting some kind of show. Humiliation burned through me, but beneath it something else stirred, anger. They thought I would break, that I would sit there and drown in shame. But as I caught sight of the disgust in some of my relatives' eyes, not at me, but at my parents, I felt a spark. My heart still hurt, my wedding still felt ruined, but I refused to let them see me crushed. I sat down quietly, lifted my chin, and forced myself to meet the eyes around the table. My parents wanted to strip me of everything, but in that moment I promised myself they would not win. Inside, I began to build a vow stronger than any I would speak at the altar. I would find a way to rise above them, and one day they would regret underestimating me. When Daniel arrived that morning, I couldn't look at him. My heart pounded as I stood at the top of the stairs, my bare head exposed for the first time outside that house. I thought about running back to my room and locking the door, but it was too late. He had already seen me. His eyes widened for a moment, but instead of shock turning to rejection, he hurried up the steps and pulled me into his arms. I couldn't hold back anymore. Everything I had been forcing down since I woke spilled out in sobs against his chest. I kept saying I was sorry, that I was ruined, that the wedding couldn't go on like this. But he held me tighter, whispering that nothing had changed. He told me I was still the woman he loved, that hair didn't define me, and that nothing my parents did could take away what we had built together. His words hit harder than I expected, and my knees nearly gave out from the release of fear I had been carrying. For the first time since waking up in that nightmare, I felt seen. I had been bracing myself for rejection, certain he would look at me differently, but he kissed my forehead gently and told me that if anything, he loved me more for standing there so vulnerable. The weight of his embrace replaced my shame with something else, relief and slowly strength. Then his expression shifted. When I told him exactly what had been done to me, his jaw clenched so hard I thought he might break a tooth. His eyes darkened with fury as he demanded to know how they could do such a thing to their own daughter. He paced the hallway, fists clenched, muttering that he had never hated anyone before, but now he understood what hate felt like. He wanted to storm into the dining room and confront them right there, but I stopped him, grabbing his hand. I told him it wasn't the time, not yet. Daniel looked at me with a mix of rage and helplessness, asking how I could even stand in the same house with them after what they had done. I admitted that I didn't know, but I also told him something I hadn't realized until that very moment. I wasn't going to hide. If I let them destroy the wedding, then they would have won. They wanted me humiliated, small, broken. I couldn't give them that victory. He nodded slowly, his breathing uneven, but I could see in his eyes that he trusted me to decide what came next. I wiped my tears and told him the wedding would still happen. But this time, it wouldn't just be about celebrating love. It would be about defying the people who tried to take it away. I said I wouldn't cover my head or try to disguise what they had done. I would walk down the aisle exactly as I was. Daniel pulled me close again and promised that no matter what anyone whispered, I would never face it alone. His arms around me were warm and steady, and in that moment, I stopped feeling like a victim. For the first time since the nightmare began, I felt a spark of control. It wasn't just about surviving anymore, it was about fighting back. The morning of the wedding arrived, and I stood in front of the mirror once more, this time not with tears, but with resolve. Daniel had offered to find me a wig or even a delicate headpiece, but I shook my head. I wasn't going to hide. If I walked down that aisle covered, then my parents would get exactly what they wanted, my silence. I wanted everyone to see the truth, not just the version they tried to present. When I stepped out of the car at the venue, the air grew heavy with stares. Some guests froze, mouths slightly open, while others whispered to each other as I walked by. A few faces softened, offering small smiles of encouragement, but the murmur of shock followed me like an echo. I kept my chin up and gripped Daniel's hand, refusing to let my courage waver. Inside the hall, the whispers grew louder. Relatives who had gathered for a day of joy now found themselves struggling to understand what had happened. I could see my mother sitting stiffly in the front row, my father beside her. Both of them wore forced smiles, as though they believed they could spin the story in their favor. But when our eyes met, I didn't look away. I walked straight toward them, my steps slow but steady. Before the ceremony could begin, I turned to face the room. My voice shook at first, but it grew stronger with each word. I told them what had happened the night before, how I had been drugged at the dinner table, and how I woke up to find my head shaved by the very people who were supposed to protect me. Gasps rippled through the crowd. My mother's smile faltered, and my father's hand twitched nervously against his leg. They tried to interrupt, denying it outright. My mother claimed I was imagining things, that I must have done it to myself in some strange fit. My father insisted they would never hurt their daughter, speaking with false outrage. But their voices cracked, their faces too tight with panic, and I could see in the eyes of my family that they weren't convinced. Whispers shifted from confusion to anger, and I knew the truth was finally slipping through the cracks of their perfect facade. Daniel moved to my side, his hand finding mine again, and the strength in that small gesture kept me steady. He didn't need to say anything. His presence told me everything. We turned back toward the officiant, and the ceremony began. The whispers continued, but I let them wash over me. My parents sat stiff and silent, powerless for once, unable to twist the moment in their favor. When Daniel spoke his vows, his voice was steady, filled with certainty. He promised love and loyalty, not just through easy days, but through storms like this one. I answered with my own, my words carrying the weight of everything I had endured and everything I still hoped for. There was no shame in my voice, only defiance and love. As we sealed our vows, I looked once more toward my parents. Their faces were pale, their eyes darting around the room, searching for support that wasn't there. For the first time, I saw them shaken. And for the first time, I felt free, standing beside Daniel as his wife, not as the daughter they tried to break. After the wedding, Daniel and I made a decision we both knew was necessary. We didn't send a message, we didn't explain, we didn't argue. We simply cut my parents out of our lives. There were no more phone calls, no visits, no acknowledgement of their existence. They had crossed a line so deep that no apology could ever touch it. At first, I expected them to push back, to show up at our door or flood us with messages, but the silence came quickly. It wasn't because they accepted our choice. It was because they were too busy trying to patch the cracks in the image they had built for years. Word of what happened at the ceremony had spread faster than I could have imagined. Relatives who once adored them began asking questions they couldn't answer. People whispered about the drugs, the cruelty, the control they had always tried to hide. Family members who used to gather at their house for every holiday started finding reasons not to show up. Invitations were ignored. Phone calls went unanswered. The proud smiles my parents wore in public began to fade when they realized no one believed their side of the story. The reputation they cared for more than anything was slipping away, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. Daniel and I didn't spend our days chasing after gossip or updates about them, but news found its way to us regardless. My cousin mentioned at one point that Margaret had cried in front of the family, insisting I was lying. An uncle shrugged and said Frank had grown bitter, snapping at people in town. Slowly, the network of loyalty they had built began to crumble, and for the first time in my life, they were standing alone. Meanwhile, I poured my energy into my new life with Daniel. We moved into a small apartment, nothing fancy, but it felt like the safest place in the world because it was ours. Every corner held laughter. Every meal was free of judgment. Every night ended in peace instead of conflict. I found joy in the quiet moments, cooking together, decorating our home, planning for the future. For once, happiness didn't feel like something I had to earn or fight for. It simply existed with him. Still, the shadow of what my parents had done didn't fade. I could laugh, I could smile, but when I caught sight of my reflection and remembered that morning, the anger returned. Their voices still echoed in my head, reminding me of the way they claimed I didn't deserve joy, the way they paraded me in front of family to humiliate me. I carried that with me, not as a wound anymore, but as a reminder. I knew cutting them off was only the beginning. They had tried to strip me of everything, and while I had survived, the scars were there. Deep down, I couldn't ignore the need to hold them accountable, to show them that their cruelty had consequences. It wasn't about rage anymore. It was about reclaiming the power they had stolen from me my whole life. The silence between us was heavy, but in that silence, a seed was planted. A part of me began to plan, to imagine a day when they would no longer be able to hide behind lies or fake smiles. I didn't know how or when, but I knew I would not let the story end with them simply fading into the background. One day, they would feel what I had felt, and when that time came, it would be my choice, not theirs. Months passed quietly, but then I began hearing pieces of news that caught my attention. It started small. My aunt mentioning that my parents' house looked a little less cared for, a cousin saying my father seemed distracted, my mother skipping her usual shopping trips. At first, I thought nothing of it, but then I overheard a conversation at a family gathering that told me the truth. My parents were drowning in debt. They had spent years showing off, buying what they couldn't afford just to prove they were above everyone else. Now the bills had piled up, and their savings were gone. The perfect picture they loved to paint was cracking. And just when I thought I'd never hear from them again, I got a call. My mother's voice was overly sweet, her tone the same one she used when she wanted something. She told me they missed me, that they wanted to mend things, and that maybe we could meet for dinner. Daniel listened as I repeated her words, and he shook his head, already knowing what was happening. But instead of ignoring her, I decided to go. Not because I believed her, but because I wanted to see exactly what they were planning. At dinner, they acted as though nothing had ever happened. My father smiled too wide, my mother complimented my dress, and both avoided looking at my bare scalp as my hair was still short. After a few minutes of small talk, the real reason came out. They spoke of unexpected expenses, of things being tight for now, and hinted that maybe I could help them out. My mother squeezed my hand and said, "It would mean the world to us, darling." I nodded as if I understood, acting concerned, even asking questions about what they needed. Inside, though, I felt a rush of cold satisfaction. They had humiliated me, tried to break me, and now they were pretending everything was fine just to get money. I promised myself I wouldn't give them a single cent, but I also realized this was my chance to do something more. When Daniel and I returned home, I told him what had happened. He wasn't surprised, but he supported the idea forming in my mind. I wanted proof. For years, my parents had treated me like I was worthless, but now I wanted to gather everything that showed the truth about them. Not just for me, but for everyone they had deceived. I began pulling together old text messages, emails, and even voicemails. Every cutting remark, every manipulation, every time they belittled me. I wrote down memories as clearly as I could, adding dates and details. Slowly, a picture formed, one that showed years of cruelty hidden behind their polite smiles. The more I dug, the more determined I became. This wasn't just about their debt anymore. This was about finally showing who they really were. They wanted me to save them, to rescue their image, but I was preparing to expose them instead. Each night, Daniel sat beside me as I worked, reminding me that I wasn't alone in this. I had carried their abuse in silence for too long. Now, for the first time, I had the chance to turn it all back on them. The family reunion was held at my uncle's house, a large gathering where almost everyone showed up. For years, these events had been my parents' stage. They were always the ones boasting, always showing off. This time, I walked in with a folder under my arm and Daniel by my side. My hands trembled, but I wasn't nervous anymore. I was ready. When everyone had gathered in the living room, chatting and catching up, I stood and asked for their attention. The room quieted, surprised at my boldness. I took a deep breath and began to speak. My voice was steady as I told them what had happened the night before my wedding. I explained how I had been given something in my drink, how I had passed out, and how I woke to find my head shaved. Faces around the room shifted from curiosity to horror. Some gasped, others shook their heads. Before my parents could cut in, I opened the folder and laid out the papers on the coffee table. I showed the hospital report that confirmed traces of the drug in my system. I handed out printed messages, proof of the manipulation and cruel words they had used against me over the years. I even included bank statements that revealed their mounting debt, hidden behind years of pretending they were financially stable. My mother jumped up, her face red. She shouted that I was lying, that I was exaggerating. My father raised his voice, accusing me of trying to destroy them. Their words grew sharper, but their desperation was clear. Every time they denied something, I slid another piece of evidence across the table. Their shouting grew weaker as the truth became undeniable. The room, once full of chatter, was now heavy with silence broken only by the rustle of papers. My relatives stared at my parents, their expressions hardening. My aunt, who had always defended my mother, turned away from her with disgust. My cousins whispered to each other, shaking their heads. My uncle, usually quiet, asked my father outright if he had really drugged his own daughter. My father's silence was the only answer needed. As their voices faltered, mine grew stronger. I didn't cry, I didn't shout. I simply laid out the truth piece by piece until no one in the room could deny what had been done. The weight that had been pressing on me for years lifted as I finally let it all out. By the time I finished, my parents weren't standing tall anymore. Their eyes darted around, searching for someone to defend them, but no one did. Family members who once admired them now looked at them with nothing but disappointment. Their proud image, the one they had guarded so carefully, was in ruins. I sat back down beside Daniel, my folder now empty, my heart steady. The silence in the room was deafening, but it wasn't mine to carry anymore. It was theirs. For the first time, my parents were the ones exposed, and there was no going back. Filing the complaint was the hardest step, but once I walked into the police station and told the officer everything, I felt a weight come off my shoulders. I gave them the hospital report, the messages, and every detail of that night. They listened carefully, wrote everything down, and assured me the case was serious. Leaving the station, I felt both nervous and relieved. The process had officially begun. Within weeks, officers contacted my parents. I wasn't there when they showed up at their door, but I heard later that neighbors saw the patrol car parked outside. For people who lived their lives obsessed with appearances, nothing could have cut deeper. They had to open their door to the police and answer questions they couldn't twist or hide from. The investigation moved quickly. My parents were asked to come in for questioning, and though they tried to appear calm, I knew they were shaken. Their voices didn't carry the same confidence as before. The evidence was too strong, and the drug test results were impossible to dispute. Seeing their power slip away gave me a sense of justice I had long been waiting for. Not only did I want accountability, but I also pushed for damages. My lawyer helped me file for financial restitution. The argument was clear. What they did caused me emotional pain, humiliation, and lasting harm. They had tried to destroy the most important day of my life. They had to face the cost of their cruelty. Court dates followed. Walking into the courtroom was surreal. I sat with Daniel beside me while my parents took their seats across the room. For the first time, they weren't in control. They weren't hosts at a family event or respected members of the community. They were defendants, and the truth about them was about to be laid out in public for everyone to hear. The prosecutors presented the medical records, the messages, and my statement. My parents' lawyer tried to paint me as dramatic, but each piece of evidence crushed their arguments. My mother's attempts to look composed failed when confronted with her own words in writing. My father, usually confident and loud, grew pale and quiet. The more that was revealed, the more their pride unraveled. The courtroom was filled with people from the community. Some had known my parents for years, always believing them to be respectable. Now they watched as every secret came out. The drugging, the control, the manipulation, all of it became part of the record, something they could never erase. When the judge finally spoke, it was clear. Charges were upheld, and the case would move forward. The request for financial damages was also granted. My parents would not only face possible punishment, but would also have to pay for the harm they had caused. Walking out of that courtroom, I didn't feel joy or triumph. What I felt was finality. For so long, they had carried themselves with untouchable pride, looking down on me and anyone else they chose. Now their names were tied to shame, their secrets exposed for everyone to see. Their downfall wasn't dramatic shouting or sudden collapse. It was the slow crumbling of everything they had built. Pride had been their shield, but now it was gone. They could no longer hide behind it. The weight of the court battle and the endless bills finally broke them. Margaret and Frank had always lived as if their money and image could cover every mistake, but debt grew heavier each month. Legal costs stacked on top of what they already owed. It wasn't long before the bank took their house. The place they once flaunted at family gatherings now sat with a foreclosure sign in the front yard. Their neighbors watched in silence as moving trucks carried away what little they could keep. Without their home, they had nowhere to host dinners or play the role of the perfect couple. The whispers spread quickly through the neighborhood. People who once greeted them warmly avoided eye contact. At the grocery store, conversations hushed when they walked by. Their friends no longer called, and even close relatives distanced themselves. The reputation they had clung to for decades slipped through their fingers, leaving only silence and shame. When everything else failed, they turned to me. One evening, I found them waiting outside my door. Their faces looked tired, worn down by stress. My mother's voice trembled as she spoke about how hard things had become. She tried to say everything they had done was out of love, that they were trying to protect me from making choices they didn't agree with. My father nodded beside her, quieter than I'd ever seen him, muttering that they never meant for things to go so far. Their words might have once pierced me, but standing there with Daniel's hand resting gently at my back, I felt nothing but calm. I listened, but there was no space in me left for their excuses. Protection didn't come in the form of drugs and humiliation. Love wasn't control disguised as care. They weren't protecting me. They were breaking me down to keep me under their power. I told them as much. My voice didn't rise, and I didn't let anger take over. I simply said that they had destroyed any right to my trust or affection. They had chosen control over compassion, cruelty over kindness, and now they were reaping the result of those choices. Their attempts to paint themselves as misunderstood parents couldn't erase the scars of what they had done. Margaret's eyes filled with tears, and Frank looked away, ashamed, but I didn't waver. I wasn't their little girl anymore, and I refused to carry the weight of their guilt. I wished them no harm, but I made it clear they had no place in my life. That was the last line they could never cross back over. As they left, a quiet sense of relief settled inside me. For years, I had lived under their shadow, bending under their words and demands. Now, with their power gone, I finally stood on my own. Their downfall wasn't something I celebrated, but it gave me freedom. For the first time, I felt untangled from their grip. My life was mine, my choices were mine, and my love with Daniel stood untouched by their bitterness. Walking back inside, I realized I wasn't broken anymore. Their collapse marked the end of their hold on me, and the beginning of my peace. I moved forward with Daniel, leaving the wreckage of my past behind. Our days became calm, filled with small routines and laughter that felt real. I kept my head shaved for months, not as a scar of pain but as a mark of strength. When people looked at me, I knew they saw confidence, not shame. Later, when I let my hair grow back, it was on my terms, not because anyone pushed me to. My parents, who once carried themselves with pride and control, now lived in silence and regret. Everyone knew what they had done, and their reputation was gone for good. They had no power over me anymore. Their downfall didn't matter to me. I no longer needed to think about them. They were simply part of a chapter one had closed. I found peace in the simple act of living without fear. I stopped seeking revenge, because the greatest victory was the quiet happiness I built for myself. Daniel and I created a home filled with love, respect, and safety. For the first time, I felt like my life was truly mine, not something others could control. I know I will never forget what was done to me. That betrayal marked me, but it does not define me. I am no longer the daughter who lived under their shadow. I am my own person. Closing that door didn't mean forgiveness. It meant freedom. With Daniel by my side and strength within me, I stepped into a new beginning. What once felt like the end of everything had become the start of the life I always wanted. Free, loved, and unshaken in the truth that my story belongs to me. Do you think I was right to cut my parents out completely, or should I have given them another chance? Share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear them. And don't forget to follow for more stories like this.